My goodness, what a disciplined group. If I could just begin by welcoming you all to this evening's event with the great Professor Hennessy. I agreed with him that I would chair this event. And just to introduce myself, my name is Richard Mottram, and for a time I was associated with some of the subject matter that we're going to look at this evening. I was at one stage responsible for the government's war book and for transition to war arrangements in the 1970s. Or so Peter Hennessy tells me, because he keeps finding my name on the files. It's all just a blur as far as I'm concerned. And then latterly I was the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, amongst other things, and in charge of intelligence, security and resilience until November 2007. And I'd just like to point out for anyone who's looking for talent, think about the trajectory of the government after I left. Now, it's a double honour for me this evening to be introducing this event. And the first reason why it's an honour is because I'm introducing Peter Hennessy, and I've seen Peter's journey from enfant terrible, the man who was banned from any contact. We were all banned from any contact with him when he was the Whitehall correspondent, and therefore we all immediately phoned him up. From that journey of being on the outside to his current position as national treasure. And along the way, occasionally I've been useful to him, and I've appeared as private information. And now he quotes me by name, so you can see that I'm finished. The real reason why I was very, very keen to have the chance to say a few words this evening, and why Peter kindly invited me, is that for those of you who buy the book, and I recommend you do buy the book, marvellous value. Those of you who buy the book, you will discover that it is dedicated to my old boss and the old boss of a number of people in the room, Sir Michael Quinland, the former Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence. And I'm delighted to say that Mary Quinlan is here, and other Quinlans probably. And I just wanted to say a few words about Michael Quinlan and why I think it is that Peter dedicated the book to him. Because he was, for those of us who were civil servants, those who worked for him, he was absolutely preeminent in the field that Peter is going to go on to discuss. He was an extraordinarily gifted person in terms of his capacity to analyse problems. He had great capacity to weigh things one against another carefully, and in very subtle prose and so on. Above all, he had clarity of direction and a great drive to get there. And those of us who worked for him found it very, very demanding, but we had the greatest admiration for him, and that was both because of what he stood for and for the integrity that lay behind his whole approach. So it is a great honour for me to have this opportunity for both those reasons. And on that basis, I'm about to hand over to Peter. The event will run till 7:15. It will end on the dot at 7:15. Peter is going to absolutely keep time. I've done reasonably well so far. And then we'll have time for some questions, and then we can have a more informal discussion over a drink. So, my great honour to introduce Peter Hennessy.
Thank you, Richard, very much for that very generous introduction. Is the sound all right at the back? Good, thank you. Can I add my tribute to Michael Quinlan to Richard's tribute? Unlike Richard or Kevin Tevitt or David Omand, or many more of you actually in this room, I never worked for Michael, nor was my prose ever subjected to that ferociously wonderful combination of grammatical order and fearsome word power that a grade 1 listed classical mind like Michael's never failed to mobilise. Yet he was a very special mentor and a great friend to me, and the new book, about which I'll talk in a moment, is shot through with the fully attributed wisdom of Big Q, as we called him, to whose memory it's dedicated. Michael stood out in so many ways. The wit, the learning, and the utter straightness of character led Robert Armstrong to say of his and Michael's Whitehall generation, of Michael, he was the best of us, the shining light. How we need that light today, how we miss it. Ladies and gentlemen, a key but often overlooked element in the historian's trade is that we are constantly dealing with unfinished business. We are, or we should be, haunted by what we miss, let alone by what we fail to understand, in our attempt to pick up the particles and the patterns of the past. Sometimes it's a matter of big things, not just a question of granules or minute particulars. It makes us edgy in the benign and old-fashioned sense of that word, a divine edginess, perhaps, that runs alongside the divine spark of curiosity. There is a sub-branch of our collective unfinished business, however, that brings a touch of consolation, catch-up history. And it's this that has been the motivation for me writing The Secret State in its original and its new incarnations, to peer a little bit into that part of the Cold War British state which, for understandable and obvious reasons, had to be kept under serious wraps while the Cold War lasted. The consolation for me is all the greater because I didn't expect the Cold War to end in my lifetime. The best that I thought we could hope for was what Elliot Richardson once called a safer, cheaper form of deadlock. And the fact that it did end without global war or nuclear exchange remains, I'm convinced, the greatest shared boon of our era. And I'm very much a child of what Michael Frayn has called the Uranium Age. And curiosity about the Cold War runs deep within me. On that theme, the ending of the Cold War, it's now become a cliche to upbraid the intelligence agencies of the NATO powers, including our own, for failing to predict the demise of the Soviet Union and the politico-economic system on which it rested. I've never taken that view. Even if MI6 had possessed a human agent inside Mikhail Gorbachev's most innermost circle of the late 1980s, he or she would not have been able to outline the coming geopolitical soft landing in snatched conversations with his or her MI6 controller. Because as Mr. Gorbachev explained when he was in London last month, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the last thing he intended. He said to Mary Dejevsky, "We should have prevented it, mostly though I reproach myself, even today. I think we went too fast," he said. "A country with our history should have taken an evolutionary course. I said reforms would need 20 or 30 years. But such passions were raging as Glasnost and Perestroika. They gained pace, and the calls," he said, and he thumped the table, "were mostly to go faster, faster, to go on, go on." British intelligence was plagued by the old secrets and mysteries problem. What do I mean by that? Well, during the Cold War, the hardest job of intelligence was to divine the mysteries of the other side, the intentions of successive Soviet leaderships, rather than the Soviet Union's secrets, the things you could get, albeit with great difficulty, the capability of the Warsaw Pact's weapons, its orders of battle, especially once the US satellites were aloft after 1960. But even if GCHQ had managed to wire up Mr. Gorbachev's little grey cells, they could not have presented the Joint Intelligence Committee in Whitehall with an advance copy of the story as it was actually to unfold. And as a friend of mine in the intelligence business said the other day after the Gorbachev interview in The Independent, speaking of people like Gorbachev, they are often mysteries unto themselves. Back now to our own British secrets and the attempts of my own, my colleagues and my students to get them out of the deep freeze. And I think deep freeze is the theme. Lots of my National Archives friends are here. And I think what they do really is they're deep freeze keepers for us. The documents are in fact a kind of frozen history. And the trick is to warm them up a bit so that, metaphorically speaking, their limbs begin to twitch, their lungs fill with air, and they begin to talk to us. We can interrogate them. It takes a while. It takes a while. And we owe a very great deal, we historians, to William Walgrave, John Major's Cabinet Office Minister with responsibility for open government in the mid-1990s. A remarkable man. How rare it is, ladies and gentlemen, to have a Cabinet Minister who not only reads history, believes in its utility. Quite extraordinary, a one-off almost. Now that's a bit uncommon, but almost a one-off. And it was a very considerable historical breakthrough, it turned out, when in an interview with me for the BBC Radio 4 Analysis programme, he invited historians to let him know which files that had been retained beyond the normal 30 years they would like Whitehall to re-review to see if they could now be released to the National Archives. And by the time Whitehall stopped counting the fruits of the Walgrave Initiative, as we called it, in 1998, some 96,000 files had been liberated by the process, which continues to this day. Freedom of information is a wonderful thing. I bored for England about the need for it for a very long time, but it's not very good for historians because you get little bits. We need runs of documents, great runs of documents, and that's what the Walgrave Initiative did, and it still does. And the tally must be well over 150,000 files now, well over. And the Walgrave Initiative gave us, in effect, a substantial new historical currency with which to trade, and the product is a growing number of books, articles and theses at PhD, master's and undergraduate levels. And the flow, since The Secret State was first published 8 years ago, has been rich and revealing. Let me give you a few examples of the newer stuff from the contents of the new edition. Perhaps the most chilling and dramatic come from the plans for the final days and hours of peace before a Third World War engulfed the UK and a substantial part of the globe. One piece of detailed planning was kept from ministers. Which of them would go to what bunker? They never knew. 2 files have been declassified since the first edition of the book. One contains the list drawn up by Mr. Harold Macmillan, or for him, and he signed it off in September 1961, as the Berlin crisis worsened and moved towards that great standoff of tanks at Checkpoint Charlie, which the more veteran members of the audience will remember as if it's yesterday. The other is the comparable list shown to Harold Wilson in June 1966, at a time when we were threatened by nothing more than a sterling crisis and the possibility of losing to West Germany in the World Cup, and nothing changes then. Only the pair of ministers chosen by Macmillan and Wilson to be their deputies for nuclear retaliation purposes, lest the PM be out of reach or already wiped out by a bolt from the blue nuclear attack, only they knew of their bunker functions in advance. This system, by the way, was new in September 1961, and Harold Macmillan was briefed by the Cabinet Office that the time had come to choose his deputies. And he signed them off in that spidery handwriting, had a bullet through his hand at the Battle of Loos. It's pretty illegible, with a characteristic dash of comedy noir and Shakespearean allusion. I agree the following. First gravedigger, Mr. Butler. Second gravedigger, Mr. Lloyd. HM, 6th of October 1961. Apart from the deputies, Wilson's in 1966 with Bert Bowden and Dennis Healing, none of the others knew of their fate until either they found the files in the National Archives in the last few weeks, or they read the London Might Be Silenced chapter in the new edition of The Secret State. There are very few of them still alive. It's interesting and reassuring for those of us of a certain age that Wilson kept his mercurial deputy George Brown well away from the June 1966, Brown was earmarked for the World War III War Cabinet bunker under Box Hill in the Wiltshire Cotswolds, the famous Turnstyle, as it was codenamed, to which Wilson, his Foreign Secretary Michael Stewart, his Cabinet Secretary Bert Trent, plus 23 other senior military official and diplomatic advisors would have been whisked from Horse Guards parade by RAF helicopters in the final moments of peace, preventive diplomacy having failed, as we now know from yet another file released recently, codenamed Operation Visitation. When I produced the first edition of this, in the little summary done for the Queen, there was Operation Visitation at the end of the process, and I thought it would be the code name for nuclear retaliation, because it had a suit of the Old Testament there about it. But no, it's not. It's the last-minute evacuation plans, the RAF helicopters coming to Little Rissington, refuel at Northolt, whisk them off, and hopefully get them there in time. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a God of the archives, there really is. And this scholarly deity shone on me a year ago, after the Cabinet Office had convened a high-level meeting which agreed to my request for a central government war book. This is the central government war book that pulls all the plans together from across the departments of the military. And they produced the 1970 version in time for me to deliver the lecture in memory of Ben Pimlott. More on that in a moment. But after that meeting, a veteran official who'd given long service to what in the Cold War was called the Cabinet Office's Overseas and Defence Secretariat, Nick Gibbons, remembered that they had a special cupboard in those days, access to which was restricted to a tiny handful of officials, and in it they kept the war books and the retaliation drills. And a search was mounted for the cupboard, and it was found in the Cabinet Office's storeroom, and a key was found. And it was full of war books stretching from 1935 to 1979. It also contained royal warrants, ready for the Queen to sign, granting pretty well absolute powers under the emergency legislation all ready to be rushed through Parliament in the last days of peace before it was prorogued for the duration. The royal warrants to turn cabinet ministers into regional commissioners in charge of the 12 civil defence regions. Mini-kingdoms, absolute powers over pretty well everything. And the beauty of the British Constitution was going to be intact even unto the rubble. And it reads like this warrant. Elizabeth II, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and our other realms and territories, Queen, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith, to our name of Cabinet Minister. Greeting, I love that bit. I mean, but ever courteous monarch. Greeting. In pursuance of Regulation 4.2 of the Defence Machinery and Government Regulations, we hereby appoint you the said name again to be a regional commissioner for the purposes of those regulations, given at our quarters St James on the something day of 19-something in the year of our reign by Her Majesty's command. At the same time, the bunker chiefs would have been given a sealed envelope, and this was in the cupboard too, containing notes of guidance for regional commissioners on what their job entailed and what it didn't, and which functions would be reserved to the Prime Minister and the War Cabinet in Turnstyle under Box Hill, such as the prosecution of the war, relationships with foreign powers. And there's room in that bunker, rooms earmarked for leading High Commissioners and Allied ambassadors. Another historical breakthrough, of a physical kind this time, was the full avowal of Turnstyle and its Cold War purpose by the Ministry of Defence in 2004. When I first visited part of it in 2001, it was still technically a deception. And I'm pretty sure the Russians were still keeping an eye on it with a satellite going over Bath at regular intervals. And if they haven't read the press or the secret state, they may well still be doing so. And a good deal of shadow boxing went on between my great friend Andy Quinn and myself, who's here in the third row, who's the RAF sergeant who took us round. And he knew that a mistake had been made in Whitehall and it should not have been avowed. And the circumlocutory conversations that went on underground that day needs to be heard to be appreciated, but mercifully Andy was free of all that since 2004, when I'd gone back with my students, BBC journalist colleagues, and former Turnstyle initiates, some of whom are here this evening, to see, for example, the Prime Minister's immensely austere personal suite, the only one with its own loo and bath, and the map room with its ministerial viewing area, from which nuclear retaliation would have been launched had the Cuban Missile Crisis carried on and tipped the world over the brink in late October, early 1962, and had the RAF helicopters which Harold McMillan, Rad Butler, Ali Hume and Coven Horse Guards in time. I have a photograph of Turnstyle, the map room of it, in the new edition. It's quite small, it's about 50 feet by 30 feet, and you will correct me if I've got it wrong, carved out of the old Bath stone quarry, and the United Kingdom equivalent of Dr. Strangelove's big ball is very modest. Doesn't cost much, and one of my great friends from the Treasury is at the back there and will approve of this. It's a chipboard, white, about this big. Very unelaborate, but that's the way the Brits would have done it. Not quite IKEA, because there wasn't IKEA around in 1960, but pretty close. So that was the big board for the end of the world, British style. And the only Cabinet Office official meeting ever to be held there was in September 2008, when Tessa Sterling, who's here today, chaired her last meeting in charge of the Cabinet Office's advisory group on security and intelligence records in the map room. And as we worked through the agenda, a fine film of limestone dust accumulated upon our persons. The Queen, by the way, was not destined for Turnstyle. The beauties, as I was saying a moment ago, the beauties and practicalities of the British Constitution had to be sustained even unto Armageddon. And it was plain to all, you see, that once Turnstyle started operating post-attack and the signals traffic began to pour out of it, Russian detection finders would be upon it and it would be rumbled. And a hydrogen bomb on top of Box Hill would have wrecked much of it. It's only 100 feet below the surface, 50 feet above Brunel's lovely railway tunnel, and certainly all the exits would have been blocked. And the first thing you see when you get underground, out of the lift into the old quarry is this grim graffito proclaiming, "Stuck here for eternity." And I've got a nice jolly picture of that in the new book as well. So the Queen, you see, is the only person. She's the Heineken Lager monarch, as my students will know. There are parts of the Constitution that only she can reach. One of those is appointing a Prime Minister. So you can't have her in the bunker with the Prime Minister. So she has to be separate. So, all that nonsense about the Royal Yacht being a hospital ship, pure balls. Pure balls. It's her floating bunker to get her away in World War III. She would be lurking in the sea locks off the northwest of Scotland, with the mountains making it difficult for the Sob radar to find her, with the Home Secretary attending her, and the Home Secretary with Her Majesty and Her Majesty's Private Secretary, the Duke of Edinburgh, could form a quorate meeting of the Privy Council to find a politician out of the rubble to appoint as Prime Minister. A useful thing, the British Constitution. A thing of wonder and mystery. Since the first editions of the book, we've had just a flicker of the Royal Yacht's role appearing in the documents. After a Russian naval attaché was trailed to caution by MI5 in early '63, I thought it might be Captain Ivanov, who was having it off with Christine Keeler, you know. But he sadly had been sent home in January that year, so it was Ivanov's successor probably. MI5 trailed into caution near the bunker and thought he's onto something. He knows something's up around this area. So alternative plans were worked up because of the vulnerability. Turnstyle Macmillan was told, and the hole near Bath may be unsafe, and he minutes in his gloomy way, whichever hole we go to, they will discover. So alternative plans were worked up so it wouldn't be one hole. And by 1968 it was ready to go, and it was codenamed Python. And we don't know very much about Python because it's still the basis of the current system. But the marvellous Nick Weeks and Alan Glennie from the Cabinet Office are here have found stuff that can be released on all this. And in one of the papers, as part of the Python system, there's a Royal Fleet Auxiliary boat called the Engadine, which presumably was for ministers, and the Royal Yacht is listed in there as another alternative. So there it is, it just flickers. What other examples of Cold War catch-up history are there in the new edition? Well, declassification of the 1970 Government War Book has enabled me to reconstruct for the first time, in a new chapter called Endgames, much, though not all, of the sequence of decision-taking taken by the simulated cabinet in its transition to War Committee during exercise Invaluable, which played out the mercifully fictional lead-up to the global war of October 1968. It begins, as all these exercises did, to a change of regime in Moscow, to a bunch of real aggressive nasties. And it was quite tense, October 68, as some of you will remember. Brezhnev had suppressed the Prague Spring just a few months earlier. And the scenario takes you through international tension, serious escalation which gets out of control, and world war, up to the so-called R for nuclear release hour. There are 16 chapters in the late 60s, early 70s government war books, and they require the taking of 200 separate decisions, 80 of them cabinet ones. It's very hard for today's generation to appreciate 80 cabinet decisions. The Blair cabinet didn't take 80 decisions in 10 years. But these 80 cabinet decisions had to be done in the space of 3 weeks, roughly. There is a hidden Whitehall heroine in the story of the strange world of the war books. She doesn't figure much in the pantheon of the great figures of post-war Whitehall, but she should. And she was called Mrs. Beryl Grimble. And she was an executive officer in the Cabinet Office who kept the war books trim and up to date from 1958 to 1973. She was known to her staff, though I suspect not to her face, as the Queen of the War Book, or Auntie Beryl. And I tried in vain to find a photograph of Mrs. Grimble for the book. And I suspect most systems rely in the end on the Mrs. Grimbles of this world, doing it for years. And there she sat on the second floor of the Cabinet Office, long before computers, cutting and pasting the latest additions to the war book, pretty well every day. And she's one of several figures in the Home, Civil and Diplomatic Services, the military and the intelligence community, who really deserve their place in the historical sun, now so many of the innermost secrets of the UK's Cold War secret state can at last be told. And these people, by and large, that did it, couldn't go home and talk about it. It must have been an immense strain, really, living on that kind of the dark side. And indeed, quite a lot of the book is about those who serve the Queen on the dark side. They tend to cluster around the first line of defence, which is intelligence, sees agents in the field, and the last line, the V-bomber crews until the late 60s and beyond, and the submariners since the late 60s on the Polaris and Trident boats. And there's a special new chapter on them in the book called The Human Button, which was the title of the Radio 4 documentary I made about them with my friend and producer Richard Knight in 2008. There's coverage too in the new edition of what I call the Appendix Z. Appendix Z was the special part of the Government War Book dealing with nuclear retaliation procedures. Copies of it were kept separate from the rest of the war book and restricted to very few. And again, they turned up in the Cabinet Office's lost cupboard. And there they all are, the drills to the end of the world. And again, I'm very grateful to the incomparable Alan Glennie and Nick Weeks for getting them ready for release in time for the book. One bit's euphemised in Appendix Z. It's, if all communications fail, special communications will apply. That's for the Navy. And that's a reference to the last resort letters, which each incoming Prime Minister since the early 70s had to sign, write and sign longhand. Nobody reads it apart from them, to go on the safe of each of the Trident boats now. Mr. Cameron's done his, and normally it's just the Cabinet Secretary who does the briefing, but this time it was the Cabinet Secretary and the new National Security Advisor together who did the briefing, but it's done. And that's when you know you were coming, when you become Prime Minister, when you have to do that. The new edition takes a look too at the very swift construction of what I call the new protective state in the UK since the dreadful events of 9/11. A great deal of it, certainly compared to the Cold War secret state, and the Cold War was still chilling our bones, has been put in the public domain. I'm now rapidly trying to catch up with the work and work patterns of David Cameron's new National Security Council, an idea I think whose time has come. Although in fact its time came in 1904. It's Arthur Balfour's Committee of Imperial Defence with a bit more IT. But we'll see, I'm still at work on that. I also have a treatment of what I call the deals between ministers and the intelligence community, as well as between the intelligence community and Parliament and the public in an open society like ours, with a very powerful intelligence tradition of our own, which we can perhaps discuss at question time. By the deal, for example, that in an open society like ours, you use your clandestine capacities only for that last opaque 5 to 10% that normal diplomatic reporting, open sources, customs and revenue, and the police can't do for you. It's intriguing to think about certain of the continuities and discontinuities of the shift from a Cold War secret state to our own new protective state. The designers of the latter, here's one of them here, were pretty well all shaped by insider Cold War experience. And the British notion of career Crown service, which did survive the Blair years by some miracle, helps ensure a remarkable continuity inside our civil, diplomatic, military and intelligence services, which I think is a huge advantage at all times, but it's certainly proven to be so in the last 10 years. Perhaps the swiftest Cold War restoration in the hours and days after 9/11 was the practice of appointing 2 ministers as the Prime Minister's deputies for nuclear retaliation purposes. This had lapsed in what feels such a strange decade now, doesn't it, between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Twin Towers. I remember when the first edition of The Secret State came out, I went on BBC Radio 5 Live with a man called Nicky Campbell. And I was on with the American cast of The Full Monty, whose knowledge of the Cold War was distinctly limited, I remember. But I made the strategic error of talking about the nuclear retaliation ministers, and it's a phone unity, and the phones went red. The entire country seemed to need to know whether John Prescott was a nuclear retaliation. And I reassured the country, because that is my role in life. I couldn't tell them who the others were. The real ones, but people were genuinely worried. So anyway, an example of discontinuity within continuity, as it were, is the intelligence secrets and mysteries equation, because it's turned round now. There's no mystery about the intentions of Al-Qaeda and its associates. It's where they are, which backstreet in our own country, which hotel room, what kit, which plot. But there's a especially chilling, almost uncanny continuity that very nearly spans the period covered by the new edition, and it's this. In a report drawn up during the anxious early days of the Korean War in September 1950, just a year after the West realized the Soviet Union had built an atomic bomb significantly sooner than expected, a highly sensitive Whitehall group, operating under the harmless and deliberately misleading title of the Imports Research Committee, examined the possibility of a clandestine atomic attack on the United Kingdom launched by Russia. They looked at the contingency of the detonation of an atomic bomb in a suicide aircraft, they called it civil aircraft, flying low over a key point. The IRC concluded, I'm quoting, it is possible, and there doesn't seem to be any answer to it. The crew of the aircraft, in order to detonate the bomb at the right time, would have to know that what their cargo was, and would therefore be a suicide squad. Short of firing on every strange civil aircraft that appears over our own shores, we know no way of preventing an aircraft that sets out in such a mission, on such a mission from succeeding. Now fast forward 60 years, and consider today's cold rules for national safety, to borrow an evocative phrase of the great historians of empire, Robinson and Gallagher. Think of the planners in 2010, and the small number of ministers, who include the Prime Minister and usually the Home Secretary, who have to contemplate and exercise the contingency of another kind of potential suicide civil aircraft flying into UK airspace from the Middle East or North Africa, refusing to answer calls from air traffic control, losing height, and soon to pass over the M25. And they have the same feelings to feel as their equivalents in the early 1950s, as the Typhoons on quick reaction alert at RAF Coningsby are in the air and ready to fire. Most of what I've had to say this evening is about the Cold War related sections of the book. It's been for me a strange enterprise writing it. I tend to go for books really that are subjects susceptible to Ealing comedy treatment, like the British Constitution. But even with the relief of the Cold War not coming to pass into a Third World War constantly in mind, it was tough to find any traces of Ealing in this story. But I did find a few, and some of them thanks to my great friend David Chin from the National Archives, who's here tonight, who has an eye for a good story, and I think must have watched Ealing when he was young, as indeed I did. Now the first story, some of you here may have heard me describe before, so I ask for your forbearance. The second I think is new. The old story first. In the early 1960s, British intelligence warned that Soviet missiles could reach our beloved soil very swiftly if the Russians launched a bolt from the blue attack from submarines in the North Sea or low trajectory missiles from East Germany. And plans were laid to alert Harold Macmillan if he were out of town in the prime ministerial limo. He didn't want any fuss, the Treasury didn't want to spend any money. So they ruled out having an officer with the codes next to him, the way the American president has, and the French president and the Russian president too. This being Britain, we didn't need fuss or cost. So a cunning plan of Baldrickian proportions was worked up, which is very us. The Prime Minister's car would be linked to the key Whitehall operations room via the system then used by the Automobile Association. Contacting the boys in those rather flash brown uniforms on the bikes and would salute. Do you remember it? You went past if they saw your AA badge. No mobile phones, then no car phones, so the AA phones. That's the answer. 3 official cars were kitted out in the spring of 1962, in time, as it turned out, for the unanticipated Cuban Missile Crisis that followed autumn. And the exchange of letters at the end of May 1962 between Brian Saunders, Private Secretary to the Minister of Works, who was then responsible for the government carpool, and the very polished Tim Bly, Macmillan's Principal Private Secretary number 10, has to be read pretty well in full to be savoured properly. Saunders tells Bly that the radios have now been fitted in 3 cars. I understand that these radios are to be maintained by Pies, an electronics firm in Cambridge now long gone, and it will presumably be necessary for someone to make a daily or weekly call to the AA control station as a check that they're in working order. I understand that if an emergency arose while the Prime Minister was on the road, the proposal is to use the radio to get into a telephone. Perhaps we should see that our drivers are provided with 4 pennies. Now, some of you of a certain age remember the 4 pennies. You could get through until you press button A. You had to have 4 pennies to press button A. This is Saunders again. I should hate to think of you trying to get change from a sixpence from a busker button. Well, there's 4 minutes of ticking by. Now, Tim Bly, very suave, it turned out, was on top of the problem. Thank you, as he wrote. The first sentence of your last paragraph is correct. But a shortage of pennies should not present quite the difficulties which you envisage. Whilst it may be desirable when motoring, I do like this language, whilst it may be desirable when motoring to carry a few pennies in one's pocket, occasions do arise when by some misfortune or miscalculation they have been expended and one is penniless. In such cases, however, it is a simple matter to have the cost of any telephone call transferred by dialing 100 and requesting reversal of the charge. And this does not take any appreciable extra time. This system works with both normal and STD, that subscriber trunk dialing telephone kiosks, and our drivers are aware of it. But this being Whitehall, one of the many reasons I've always admired Whitehall, there's always a fallback plan. And it was this, it was forming in Bly's very subtle mind. We are considering the possibility of this office taking up membership of the AA. Which will give our drivers keys to AA and RACA throughout the country. So that's all right then. I think that's perfect. And for those sensitive to questions of national identity, only the British, of all the nuclear powers existing in 1962 and those to come, could have dreamt up a system like that. And if the file containing the Saunders-Bly correspondence had leaked to the KGB resident in London, he would have thought it was a deception, if not a but it was not. My other eating moment is this, and I'll finish on it. For years amongst the war workers, a story has swirled about a leak, not to the Russians nor to the press, but to a part of Whitehall, which, when it came to wargaming, as opposed to the real thing, was not meant to be party to the decision-taking that was being simulated. And the veterans from Whitehall will remember it, it's long gone. It was called the Civil Service Catering Organisation, called Cisco, and it was in Basingstoke. And thanks to my friend Brian Gilmore, who played the Prime Minister in one of the 1970s exercises, it can now be confirmed. I do have an enduring memory, said Brian, of being briefed. Should I discover that I had received a message which required me to communicate with the Chief Executive of the Civil Service Catering Organisation, I was on no account to do so. Why was that? Because in a previous exercise, the Cisco teleprinter had suddenly tapped into action, and it didn't have exercise on it, which it should have done. It shouldn't have gone to him anyway. And he was instructed to go out on his own, in secret, and get enough provisions to stock a range of bunkers in the south and southwest for 3 months. Scarcely pausing, said Bride to say, Wilco, he did so, and the cash and carries of Hampshire were raided for tins and beans. The costs were hidden away under some obscure vote heading of the Civil Service Department and spread out over a number of years to prevent protection by the Treasury. Now, as to the fate of the peas and the beans and the sausages, ladies and gentlemen, that remains a classic Cold War mystery to this very day.